to another episode of Declassified. I'm Ashna Modi, and joining us today is Corin Larson and Annie Beebe. In this episode, we will be going into the conspiracy regarding the CIA testing hallucinogens on the French town of Pont Saint Esprit. But before we get into the details of the event, let's talk about what was historically happening during that time.
Yeah, so starting with a little bit of background, the event took place in the early 1950s and the CIA in the late 1940s. They were actually studying the behavioral influences of LSD and other drugs and the effects on them on humans.
They were also looking at the military advantages these drugs could have in benefiting America's power. Since biological warfare wasn't something entirely new, scientists had been experimenting with hallucinogens in the early 1950s around the world.
Did you know that the purpose of the experimenting with LSDs and other drugs was to create a mind control serum that could be used in the Cold War?
And it was also known as Project MK Ultra, created by the CIA. The interest of this research by the CIA was further prompted by reports from the Soviet Union was experimenting with these types of drugs for developing brainwashing techniques.
Not only did the CIA conduct this research in secret, but they participated in illegal experimentations that harmed participants physically and psychologically, bringing us to what really happened in Pont Saint Esprit.
On August 15th to 16th in 1951, the town of Pont Saint Esprit in southern France was struck by an unknown illness. The illness entailed mass insanity and hallucinations, with more than 300 people affected.
The hallucinations lasted for days, taking the lives of 7 people while several dozens were locked up in mental asylums. One anonymous witness account says, "I saw healthy men and women suddenly become terror-stricken, tearing their bed sheets and hiding under the blankets for fear of the nightmares that were haunting them."
Paul Pages, a 26-year-old at the time, remembered. There was a young guy who jumped out of a hospital window after screaming, "Look, I'm a dragonfly." He broke both of his legs. The postman was also seen zigzagging on his bike. He eventually fell. He had lost his reason.
Later, citizens found that all the victims had eaten the bread sold by Roch Brian, who was known as the best baker in the village. According to the investigators, the flour used by Roch had been contaminated with a fungus very similar to LSD. The fungus was ergot, a mold that causes paranoia and hallucinations, similar to LSD.
Interestingly enough, people began to speculate that the CIA was involved with the poisoning of this French town. We now know these types of drugs experiments have been previously conducted in MK Ultra, which was led by the CIA and American Army. As previously mentioned, the CIA was experimented with drugs in which people unknowingly consume these substances, but more specifically heroin, opium, mescaline, and LSD.
Not only were these experiments confined to the United States, but also took place in Canada, England, France, and Iraq. Is it possible that the CIA could have been experimenting on Pont Saint Esprit to further research on hallucinogens?
This theory was actually proposed by investigative journalist Hank P. Alberli Jr., who said the outbreak of Pont Saint Esprit had actually been produced by a top secret joint Army CIA experiment conducted as part of the Project MK Naomi, an adjacent project to CIA's ultra secret projects Artichoke and MK Ultra.
Should we believe this conspiracy though? And did the CIA test hallucinogens on the French town of Pont Saint Esprit in 1951? Let's take a deeper dive into both sides of the argument.
We will now consider, is the CIA to blame? Hank Alberli, an American journalist, revealed a CIA document titled R.E. Pont Saint Esprit and F. Olsen Files, S.O. Span/French Operation File, inclusive Olsen. Intel files, hand carry to Bellin, tell him to see to it that these are buried.
According to Alberli, the operation in Pont Saint Esprit was called Operation Span. The word span being a vague allusion to bridge, and the French word point translates to bridge.
Using the document, Alberli had released a statement. The village the village was the target of a CIA experiment, and that it was also part of the motive as to why Frank Olson was murdered. Frank Olson was the guy that got drugged by LSDs and jumped off the building from the hotel room. Alberli had spoken to two former colleagues of Frank Olson who said that the Pont Saint Esprit incident was part of a mind control experiment run by the CIA and US Army.
He also said the CIA was trying to use hallucinogenic drugs and LSD as an offensive weapon at that time. There had been reports written by the Army in 1949 specifically recommending the use of LSD and recommending that field experiments be engaged as quickly as possible.
Another piece of evidence that really stood out to us was the connection between the scientists who were investigating the case and the CIA. Immediately after the Pont Saint Esprit incident took place, scientists from the Sandoz Chemical Company came to investigate the event. Finally, after studying the incident for 3 to 4 weeks, they theorized that ergot poisoning was the cause, but this would be later disproved.
However, as Alberli explains, the shocking part of the story is that they did not tell anybody in 1951, and the Sandoz Chemical Company was selling and providing LSD to the US Army and CIA for its research purposes.
Alberli then backed up his claim with a transcript of a conversation between the CIA and the Swiss laboratory Sandoz. The lab made reference to the secret of Pont Saint Esprit and to dithylamine, a component of LSD. It's also important to note that Sandoz was the company to invent LSD in 1938.
Accordingly, a White House document containing information related to this conspiracy was sent to members of the Rockefeller Commission. For those who don't know, was formed in 1975 to investigate the CIA's wrongdoings.
This document contained the names of French citizens who were secretly employed by the CIA, and it directly referenced the Point Saint Pierre incident. Speaking of which, Alberli claims he found a top secret report issued in 1949 by the research director of Edgewood Arsenal, where U.S. government experiments were carried out.
Within the report states that the Army should do anything possible to launch field experiments using the drug. Since we have looked at the numerous evidence and reasons to support this conspiracy theory, it's time to consider the alternate hypothesis.
In this part, we will provide evidence that claims the CIA did not poison the French town. Stephen Kaplan, an American academic professor, published a book in 2008 on what happened to Pont Saint Esprit in 1951. He believes that neither the ergot nor the LSD were involved in causing the incident to happen.
His main points were the symptoms of LSD did not fit the symptoms the people of Point Saint Pierre were suffering with. Townspeople had digestive elements and vegetative effects that did not relate to LSD symptoms.
Also, LSD is known for how fast acting a drug it is, usually taking only up to a few hours to take on its effects. The townspeople, however, showed symptoms more than 36 hours after consuming the bread.
Another thing Kaplan points to is that LSDs wouldn't have survived in the temperatures of an oven if the LSD was in the wheat. He also questioned why the CIA would have been behind choosing Pont Saint Esprit, since it was an almost half-destroyed village left from the Second World War battles.
One of the most favored hypotheses suggests that the bread was contaminated with the ergot fungus. However, this claim is not very strong, and ergot has not existed in France since the 18th century. It can only be found in less wealthy countries.
Based on our previous statements, we have come up with the following hypothesis. The main conclusion is the CIA was involved. The sub-conclusion, the CIA drugged the people of Pont Saint Esprit. Premise 1, only the individuals in town that ate Roach's bread had hallucinations. Premise 2, there was dithylamide, a component of LSD in the bread. Premise 1 and Premise 2 are codependent. Premise 3, the CIA was studying and experimenting on different types of drugs, including LSD, at this time. Premise 4, the CIA was being prompted to study the drugs since the Soviet Union was experimenting with them in trials of hypnosis and brainwashing. Premise 5, if the ergot was in the wheat, then it would have affected multiple bakeries in different parts of France. And Premise 6, a White House document sent to the Rockefeller Commission contained the names of French citizens who had been secretly employed by the CIA and made direct reference to the Point Saint Esprit incident.
The CIA was experimenting and studying many different types of drugs. Therefore, the drug used to infect the townspeople could have been something different to LSD or an experimental version of the LSD formula. This could be why LSD symptoms and symptoms the townspeople were experiencing were different.
Yeah, so now to test for acceptability, relevance, and sufficiency. Starting with accessibility, we believe it is acceptable due to support from all the other premises that we already discussed. Premise 1 through 6 provides factual, non-opinion based statements that provide factual evidence towards our main conclusion. The CIA wasn't that the CIA was involved. Also acceptable due to expert testimony, as revealed there was dihylam dithylamide, a component of LSD in the bread. Hank L. Barely, an American journalist, and Stephen Kaplan, an American academic professor, were appropriate authorities responsible for this information. Relevance. So we believe our statement is also relevant, as many relevant facts were used to support our statement, and all were relevant and needed in order to create a strong argument with no extra unneeded details. And lastly, sufficiency. So our premises has passed acceptability and relevance test, and we believe provides enough evidence to support our main conclusion due to our facts that we have provided. Therefore, our premise is sufficient and is a good, strong argument.
Thank you for listening.